Hi, I'm Fabienne.
I'm Flick.
And we're doing a kitchen table discussion on prison abolition as part of the Law and Justice block for legal essentials.
This is going to be a super informal kitchen table discussion, so we can discuss things about justice, accountability, safety and healing in the context of prison abolition. Yeah?
Okay, so what's prison abolition, Flick?
Prison abolition, right, I think it's probably best that we start at the beginning. Well, start near the beginning, but in the kind of, if we think about the immediate context with Black Lives Matter movement.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, so as all of you should be aware, there was a catalyst for the current stream of prison abolition calls to defund the police, to abolish the prison system. And that is the murder of George Floyd by the police, and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade. There are many different people who have been recently killed by members of the police, right?
And so this has kind of ignited the Black Lives Matter movement again. So it's been going on, but it's reignited
it, new impetus.
Especially, and lots of white allies, so white people who have decided to join Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, and they begin to disentangle the whiteness that has enabled them to benefit from certain things within society, and obviously at the same time in doing that has led to the suppression and the oppression of particularly Black people, but people of colour. So yeah, the deaths of these people has been a catalyst, hasn't it, for these calls to end these institutions.
So prison abolition is not a new thing. It's been going on actually as long as the prison. When the prison was created, immediately people were trying to reform it, and others were trying to. We're calling for it to be abolished. So there is this distinction between reforming and abolishing, isn't there?
Yeah. If you think about the punishment system, the prison in itself was, born out of the desire to make punishment more humane, right? Ironically. Before that you would have public kind of floggings and
torture, executions. So punishing the body, and then Foucault famously said we're moving to punishing the soul. So we're trying to rehabilitate people. Unfortunately, that has never worked out.
No, it hasn't. And Angela Davis particularly talks about this historical attempts to reform the prison, right? And every time there's a reform, we still are coming back to the need to reform it more.
So this is Angela Davis in her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? She writes about, and other researchers have done this as well, that actually the prison, it doesn't matter how we dress it, whether we dress it as a caring institution or a healing institution, its fundamental core is always about punishment. So it will always retrench and co-opt any reforming measures and make them about upholding the institution. So the institution itself tries to survive by co-opting things like rehabilitation or and then it kind of gets incorporated into the prison, and because it's ultimately about punishment.
Yeah, for sure. And this idea that prisons don't go to the root of things. So when you hear, usually when we're talking about the police and prisons, particularly the police, so if we just take the police right now, we see them, when you're at school, and after that, if you've never had an intervention with the police, I guess, that the police are the ultimate protectors. They're the arbiters of safety. They're going to protect you, they're going to uphold your rights, they're going to ensure that you are able to live and thrive and do all the things you want to do by protecting you from violence. But actually many people don't experience that.
No.
Particularly Black people and people of colour, queer people, especially at the moment Black trans people are being increasingly marginalised by the police. And we're seeing, Lola Olufemi in her book, we have it here, so Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power, she talks about how the police use their power often to criminalise, right? Communities who are already marginalised, so they're further oppressed by police intervention. They're not protected by it, actually. They are they're kind of endangered by it, their intervention.
And she writes about how so if we look at feminism, for instance, so you've got feminism isn't a homogeneous or a one movement, and that, you know, women with different backgrounds have experienced either inequality or discrimination in different ways, because they're either coupled with race, class, sexuality. So that's what we call intersectionality.
Yeah.
So you have predominantly white liberal feminists who are calling for the law to intervene and but on the other hand, you've got it's a double-edged sword. So if we call for the law to intervene and to protect us, this is my son. He's just come home from school. Okay, so we're talking about what the double-edged sword of these are the joys of being at home and working at home. So we're talking about how it's a double-edged sword to ask for the law for help, because on the one hand, we've got lots of feminists who are calling for rape laws to be fortified, made stronger.
Yeah, to make stronger, more law, like for example, calling for misogyny to be made into a hate crime, that kind of thing.
But we also know that women have been treated historically very badly by the criminal legal system, or within, rape trials have been highly traumatic.
Yeah.
So you've got that double-edged sword, plus you've got asking for the law for protection. Women's bodies are so governed by law at every stage. Whether it's reproductive rights, all sorts of things, actually just that asking for the law to police us even more is dangerous.
It's like what we talked about recently. We went to an event about where the Me Too movement came up.
Yeah.
And so people, the Me Too movement was actually started by a black woman many years ago, and then it was subsequently kind of with Harvey Weinstein and all of those kind of different people in Hollywood and beyond who had abused their powers and exploited women particularly. Whether it's a good thing to have that, the legal institution. So this is a state institution, whether you actually, the Me Too movement was born outside of the state.
Yeah.
Whether you actually want to put kind of the process of accountability back into the state institution when they've actually perpetuated that harm in the first place.
Or employers, for instance. That's the thing. Like all these institutions and their institutional structures don't actually protect those who are vulnerable. So that's the other thing. So when Lola Olufemi writes about sexual offences and sexual violence, prison isn't the answer to that. You can think, and the first reaction could be, but what do we then? What have we got then? It's anarchy, isn't it? So then we have nothing. But if you think about it, they're failing. These institutions are failing. And there's Rob Reiner wrote this really famous book. I love the title, as the best title ever. The rich get richer and the poor get prison. And he writes about this as the Pyrrhic defeat theory. He says that a Pyrrhic defeat is something that is set up to fail. And he writes that the criminal legal system or prison system, they work through their failure. So the criminal legal system doesn't get rid of crime, but it does work because it actually keeps the status quo. So it supports capitalism, and it supports those people who benefit from the capitalist political economy. So so that's why you have people, black people, people of colour, ethnic minorities disproportionately represented in the criminal legal system and in the prison system. That's why you predominantly have people from, it's classist, so you've got people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds predominantly represented in the criminal legal system.
And white people are usually the actors in those institutions, if you look. But
the ones who are more powerful.
That's what I mean. As in like the judiciary and prosecutors, etc. The people enacting the laws against those people.
And then also you've got traditionally white working class communities who also fill both sides of it. So you've got white working class police officers, prison officers, but also they're policing and guarding people who come from their own communities. So that's also one of the other aspects.
Yeah. So if we take it back a little bit and think about the roots of this, so sexual violence in itself is a deep-rooted issue throughout society, isn't it? And Lola Olufemi talks about it in here. She says that carceral responses to sexual violence fail to address the root causes of the problem, right? So putting an offender in jail does nothing to reshape the logic of sexual and gendered violence. It doesn't. If you think about the conditions in the prison, you read about this all the time, the conditions that people are living under, the lack of access to education, the lack of access to mental health support. You can't miraculously expect somebody who has actually, committed harm against somebody, and serious harm, to be reshaped in any meaningful way if you're not going to afford them the opportunity of that.
No, and also in a very coercive institution, and actually you're not protecting those people who have been harmed.
Yeah.
And my colleague Candida, who wrote her PhD on male rape, often found in the case studies that she found is that those people who the so-called people who harmed had also been harmed as well.
Exactly.
So a lot of these a lot of the literature and also the legal approach to this dichotomizes it. You're either the victim or the perpetrator. These words are highly loaded either as well. But the fact that nobody wants to be labelled either way, but that you've been victimized, you can harm someone and have been victimized at the same time.
Yeah,
and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, they don't work in isolation from each other. They mutually constitute one each. Yeah, that's right. And how we, picking up on what you said about engaging with the harm. It's not a point of kind of brushing off the harm and saying, well, we need to be more humane. No, we have to engage fully with the trauma, the harm, in order to genuinely heal and to gain accountability for people who have been in kind of experienced harm from people.
And this is where the debate is currently at, isn't it? This is what it's called, transformative justice.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between that and restorative justice.
Yeah.
So we need to think about that, but we also need to think about what would this future look like.
Yeah.
Now, Angela Davies, again, in her amazing book, Prisons Obsolete, writes about, it's not just simply saying, okay, so we don't want the prison. We're just going to take the prison out of this and replace it with something else. That's not how it works, because we actually need to think about all these structures and these kind of criminalizing structures or power structures in which the prison sits. So we need to think about the way people are treated in schools. If you think about how detention works in schools, there's all of the very punitivity and punitive approaches exist throughout society. If you think about the welfare system, about how people are penalized and the punitive responses within the welfare system. So it's about kind of breaking open these structures and reconfiguring, rethinking about how do we go about this, how do we address harm, and what is the role of the state in all of this.
Exactly. And when we talk about prison abolition, I think we probably should have said before, but this idea of Fabienne's talking about these the school, hospitals, the prison industrial complex is what Angela Davis terms all of these interlocking systems and relationships, so judges, the criminal legal system, police,
social workers,
health workers, all are
health visitors,
undeniably linked together, and they form part of what is known as the prison industrial complex. So it's about thinking deeply about these institutions and how you can make them, whether you can make them less coercive or not, or less kind of harmful, less that is the question. So
but that's the thing. So at the moment, lots of people are still debating the abolition debate, and our argument is that in order for a post-COVID recovery, we need to start thinking about those organizations that are already doing this kind of work. So there are and it's also about thinking about how we can move forward and reconfigure, because there is I think there's a role for the state, because we can't just have communities dealing with this, because then you have the question around accountability again, and also we can't just assume that churches and other religious institutions that some people are calling for are actually going to be as open and accepting of people from different kind of
backgrounds.
So that's another thing. And also, what is the form of redress? So as public law, if we're thinking about public law here, we need a form of redress, and we need to have some kind of safeguards. So but there are, so this is where we're saying we don't have the answers, but this is where we think the debate should start now and should move forward.
For sure. And it is about recognising, as Fabienne's outlined, that there's no one sole response to all of this. We live highly complex lives, we have very complex relationships with one another, and harm in itself is actually very complex. Trauma is really complex. The failure of the criminal legal system in the sense that it's failing people in terms of their ability to live and function and be happy, etc., is that it individualizes, it gives an individual response. So it individualizes harm, it attributes it to one person or two people or whatever.
But the person who's harmed gets no redress.
Exactly. The person that's harmed gets no redress. Or they get redress under this thinly veiled.
Yeah, but they don't actually get any help, support or help. There is there is no support. So, many of us have experienced sexual violence, and actually, we never went to the police, but there was also no other form of support.
No, there wasn't.
So, and that's the kind of thing that what is more important? Is it, and again, this goes back to where does the criminal justice system come from? If you look at the name of the cases, it's always Regina, the Queen against. So it's the state. In other countries, it's the state against that individual. So it's the state in its sovereignty. The state is upholding its sovereign as the one who monopolizes violence. To actually punish on behalf of society. And our question then is, well, is this out of date? And also, is punishment the right way forward? And I don't think it is. No. Because, and this is Helga Einzel, the woman I'm researching, she always said that it's very easy to find love for a child that has done something wrong. It's much more difficult to find love for the person who has wronged another and has ended up with a life that is completely shattered, but has actually harmed someone else. And she was a prison governor in Frankfurt after the war for 30 years. She worked really, really hard to reform both the institution, but also to actually get rid of prison as a whole. So it's actually everyone, like you said, has complex lives, and everyone, we've all harmed others to a lesser or greater extent, and some have harmed more, and there needs to be some form of redress, in a sense, some form of support for the person who's been harmed. And also some kind of response to the person who's harmed. And sometimes it may mean that they need to be removed from society for a short period of time. But most of the time, like example, in one of those, remember when there was this, I think there was a BLM protest, and somebody from the EDL urinated on this police officer's picture outside Parliament. Now that was a deeply disrespectful thing to do. But the guy went to prison. Why did this person go to prison? How will that change his deeply right-wing views? And maybe his racist views if he goes to prison? It won't change anything. No. And it's probably a badge of honour on top of it. But potentially he may lose his job, he may lose his home, he may lose everything just for that. Don't think there's any, and it's very expensive. So I think as well it's expensive, right? What we should be aiming for is what prison abolitionists say is the basic, right? So that is food, shelter, access to mental health services that are non-coercive, having, working just support, are kind of, that are not exploitative. That is the word I'm looking for. So one of the women I interviewed who also worked in this Frankfurt women's prison, but from the 70s later on, she said a lot of the time the women arrived with stacks of unopened mail. So they ended up in prison because they didn't open their mail, because they ignored court orders, they did all of those things, because their life, they couldn't function at that point in time. And yeah, I can understand that, actually. I can understand how you can get to that point.
Yeah.
So we can't assume that everyone who's in prison has done something horrendous. Most people haven't. No. Half of people are in prison for sentences that are below 4 years.
Yeah. And so, also those are people who have committed, serious kind of harm, have often been abused as children, or are subject to domestic violence, or have been exploited via drugs, gang violence. It's not a it's not a justification for the harm but it's an explanation as to why they may have also committed harm.
So cool. Okay, so we've got to that point. Do you want to talk about #8abolition?
Yeah, so this is about, Angela Davis, as we talked about earlier, talks about, it's not just about, and so does another person called Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Prison abolition is not just about tearing down walls, it's about building, right? It's about presence, not just absence. And Angela Davis says that, in this work to abolish the prison, we have to crowd out these institutions, right? And 8 to Abolition, which is a US-centered organisation, a grassroots movement, actually, I should say. They have 8 steps, right, to ensuring truly safe, protected, happy communities. And they call to defund the police, they call to abolish prisons.
But see, this is also US centered, but a lot of these things work for us as well. So remove police from schools. We don't have police in schools, but if you think about how the whole approach to schooling has changed with the Conservative government, and that it's become very punitive. Lots of detention,
isolation rooms, right? When you're at school, and if you do something wrong, you get put into isolation, or whatever your school calls it. That means that you are in isolation from every single person that you associate with, in school. You're in a thing where you walls that are essentially
cubicle.
Like a cubicle. You're sat there on your own,
and it kind of
with someone watching you. It's
recalls images of how in the separate and silent system, people went to church. They had these little cubicles in prison, and then they were just sat in an individual because they weren't allowed to talk to anyone. So these things are just, and then if you think about prevent. The government's prevent strategy and how that is used in schools, creates a culture of fear. It disproportionately targets people from certain communities. So with Muslim backgrounds, people are afraid to be themselves, to talk about their families in school, because they're being watched, and teachers have this a lot of pressure on them to report.
But overarching to all of these things is care, right? This is a collective approach to care, love,
and healing.
And these are not utopian things, right? So, it's well known that prison abolitionists are often dismissed for being utopian or having...
But equally, you could say that people who support the prison system are utopian and idealistic, because actually you can't lock everyone up, because you never catch everyone. Secondly, it can't rehabilitate. That's been proven. And how should that work? You're locking people up, you're coercing them. They're in an awful coercive. And nowadays, if you look at Inquest, that's a charity that looks into prison deaths. They're so overcrowded, the prisons, that suicide rates have gone up. Self-inflicted deaths have gone up. I apologise for saying suicide. You shouldn't be saying that. Self-inflicted deaths, self-harm have gone up, and. So it's not utopian to strive. It's about emphasis on what are we striving towards. We're striving towards a society that cares
It's more equitable.
Yeah, and so actually what we're then saying is, and we can hear you saying it, it's like, well, it won't work under the current capitalist system.
Yeah.
So actually...
You're right, if you're thinking
we
that.
need to critique capitalism. Now there's a question of whether we look to other countries that have different forms of capitalism, because we've got quite a strict neoliberal form of capitalism, apart from the NHS, which is the only socialist organisation still left in the UK, mass organisation. But yeah, so we need to think about that. And actually, if we are thinking about alternatives to capitalism, this puts us talking about this now on the government's list of seriously.
Yeah, no.
We're not supposed to talk about anything that challenges the existing political economy.
Yeah.
But I think we need to talk about this because capitalism is exploitative. It creates these huge income disparities that we've seen over the last 10-15 years.
And it's necropolitical, right? It chooses who lives and who dies, right? And that is what capitalism does.
Yeah. And so to link this up with Judith Butler's new book, The Force of Non-Violence, Judith Butler talks about the distinction between, and this is exactly what Flick has just been saying, is between grievable and ungrievable lives. So it's who we choose to grieve. So the people in Lesbos whose refugee camp has just burned down and who are living in the streets, people who are dying crossing the Channel, crossing the Mediterranean, those people are not within our scope of being grievable, and this has to change. For true equality, we need to change that. We need to think about that people are grievable and that we bring them in the scope of grievable lives.
Yeah, so it's like what Lola says in her book. So she says that feminism is for everybody.
Yeah.
So in order to have justice, that has to mean everybody.
Yeah.
It can't just mean certain lives above others like it is right now. Predominantly white lives above black lives.
Or the feminists like J.K. Rowling who say that trans women aren't real women. For us, that's a nonsensical debate. Yeah. And it's a debate deflects from what is really going on, namely that trans women are often the most marginalised.
Trans women are dying in droves every single day, and they are being killed by police, they're being killed by state institutions, they're being killed by their partners in, domestic violence kind of situations. Totally deflects from the root, which is what we spoke about before, right? The root harm. Yeah. These are all surface level and unimportant, they're not debates. Like it's
So if you like what you hear, so we'd encourage you to read the material that we've provided. We look forward to talking to you the tutorial about this. Yeah. We've also created a collective and collaborative forum or platform entitled Read and Resist. It's a website, www.read-and-resist-.org. Yeah, and basically part of that we have a reading group that runs. The first session is on the 14th of October, and it's all about joy, pleasure, and thinking about post-COVID recovery. You can sign up through the website on Eventbrite. Yeah. You need to sign up on Eventbrite so that we can register you so that you can access the link. Yeah. But we'd love to have you join us.
Yeah, and that's it from us, I think. So thanks for listening.
Thank you.